Uh, as always, let me start off by, as I've been talking with Penny and Kathy and Rod here. Margaret, how are you this morning?
I'm good. I'm running a little late, so I'm eating because I haven't done it yet today.
Okay,
I'm
don't
sorry.
don't worry, don't worry. It's all relaxed around here, okay? It's all relaxed. Were there any questions that any of you had from last week or the previous week that is on your mind right now, before we begin? I might be able to address. Okay. All right, well, let's get going. I have a thesis for this course, which is that the actions against Richard Nixon, forcing him into resignation, was in its way a silent coup d'etat against the president, and largely because the president was ending the Cold War through his rapprochement with People's Republic of China, détente with the Soviet Union, and trying to bring to an end American involvement in Southeast Asia. The end of the Cold War, of course, meant the end of billion-dollar contracts to numerous defense manufacturers, as well as to the officers who would rotate out of, their military position and onto the boards or high-level position of these corporations. What we've seen so far, however, both in part one of this and the first two episodes of part two, we've seen the action of predominantly John Dean, who wasn't an opponent of Richard Nixon. He was in there working his own game, and he happened to be tearing at the fabric of the administration from the inside. We've also seen early on how the military had been spying on the president. They got caught and they had to back off. But that doesn't mean that they're finished. We've also looked at how the CIA, who had been cut off from the information flow, that's because the president wanted that way, of CIA, but they had managed to infiltrate two people into the White House, E. Howard Hunt and James McCord Jr. Of course, most of his work was for the committee to reelect the president, but he was still associated with the White House. What we'll begin to see today is how some of the president's external enemies, largely the Democratic Party, and specifically, I'll call it the Ted Kennedy wing of the Democratic Party, took this matter in hand and went straight at the president. And we'll see that begin to play today, but we'll also see a few mavericks carrying out their own agendas. We saw a little bit of it last week with Judge Sirica, but we'll see it with a few others as well, both with today's episode and our concluding episode next week. So that's just to kind of set it up a little bit. So let me come down and share my screen with you, and we'll get going here. So we're in part two, and today, episode 3 deals specifically with the tapes. Those are the tapes that the president had been recording in order to memorialize all the conversations in various offices where he was carrying out presidential business. So let's go. Well, after we had seen the events from last week, one can't help but ask, well, after this, what else could go wrong? And what we'll find today is, boy, a whole lot can go wrong. When we left off from our journey, John Dean had submitted his resignation to the president. And you may recall, John Dean, when the president said, I'd like you to resign, here's some copies. And he said, I'd like to write my own. And by the way, I'd like to wait toward my resignation until Haldeman and Ehrlichman resign. Dean wanted to be in league with them, so it looked like he was merely following their orders rather than his own agenda. So we're looking at, when we begin today, April 16, 1973. April 17, President told the press that after serious charges about Watergate were first made known to him, just a month before, March 21st, he had ordered another investigation. Now, White House press secretary, who we see in this photograph here, he is to the right, told the media that all the previous statements on Watergate were, I love this word, inoperative, because they'd been based on the earlier investigation, which of course referred to John Dean's work. And as we've seen, John Dean wasn't doing any investigation at all, except to protect himself. He was interfering with the investigation every step of the way. Following that, McCord filed suit charging that he had been entrapped into his activities. And this certainly takes a lot of chutzpah. Now, you'll recall from last week, McCord, just as he has been sentenced by Judge Sirica, he delivers a letter to the judge saying that I and others in this matter have been committing perjury, that we were following orders from higher ups in the White House, and now he's taking on this whole thing. I have been entrapped into doing what I was doing. Oh boy, the gall. But here we come back to Henry Peterson. Henry Peterson is Assistant Attorney General for Criminal Proceedings. He's right under Kleindienst, Richard Kleindienst. And he comes and he tells the president, you know, we had an incident a year ago that was a break-in at a psychiatrist's office out in Beverly Hills. And this news of this break-in, or the information, the history of this break-in, has recently been revealed to the grand jury. I know that you had hoped that this thing would stay quiet, but now the grand jury knows about it. And with this, everybody begins talking about when will this, where's the end of this? Scandal is mounting. Jeb Magruder, who had left his position with the completion of the president's victory in 72, he closed out the committee to re-elect, and he took a high-level position with the Commerce Department. But now people are beginning to look at him, and he is forced to resign from his high-level position. And after he had admitted in destroying files and other materials that were taken from E. Howard Hunt's safe just days after the discovery, L. Patrick Gray finally resigned as acting director of the FBI. He realized he was never going to win Senate approval, and it was time to move on. So some of the consequences of things that once seemed so bright are now coming apart. John Ehrlichman, he admitted to the FBI his knowledge of the plumber's activity, and that's primarily the break-in at the office of Lewis Fielding in Beverly Hills. There was nothing essential that he revealed to the FBI about the plumber's activity or the Special Investigative Unit, as they were known when they were digging into the spying operation of the military, that is the Moore Radford. He's really revealing to them about the Fielding break-in, which he had approved. And this begs the question, did he or did he not inform the FBI that this break-in with Fielding was a matter of national security? Because that's how the president and those around him were justifying it in their minds. Daniel Ellsberg is threatening national security. We need to know about him. We need to know, is there more things that he has planned? Let's find out from his psychiatrist if he's revealed anything to them. In their mind, the burglary at Dr. Fielding's office was national security. I don't know if Ehrlichman mentioned that or not and offered that as a defense. Nonetheless, the information regarding the Fielding break-in was sent to Judge Matthew Byrne out here in Los Angeles, where he's overseeing the Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony LaRusso trial. And this information was sent to him at the insistence of Attorney General Kleindienst. Kleindienst is trying to do the right thing. I don't want anybody accusing me of holding anything back. So when this information came to the grand jury, obviously it came to the Attorney General's office, he sent it out to Matthew Burns. Here is the judge here. But when Burns received this information, he held a conference with the prosecutors. Hey, guys, guess what your side has been doing here? And the prosecutors just wanted him to deal with this information in camera, meaning in his chambers. Let's get the defense in here. Let's tell them about this, but let's not bring this out into the open. But instead, Judge Byrne read this really provocative information aloud in his courtroom on April 27th. So one thing that we're beginning to see a lot, let me do one thing up here. Excuse me for just a second. There we go. I just wanted to get Peter into the room. We have a lot of things breaking at once, and people, and I remember myself at this time saying, how big is Watergate? When is this? Where's the outer limits of this scandal? Needless to say, the revelation of this break-in by members of the Special Investigative Unit made headlines across the nation. Well, on behalf of the defendants, Ellsberg and Tony Russo, who believe they've been wiretapped for years, Judge Byrne now asked the prosecutors for information regarding electronic surveillance. So again, this is all going out here in Los Angeles now. And they suspected that their conversations were being tapped and recorded. And Byrne said, okay, let me ask the prosecutor, what do you guys know about this? And the government said, we know nothing. And those prosecutors were honest in that appraisal. They knew nothing. Now, people above them knew something, but not the prosecutors out here in LA. Monday, April 30th, in the wake of the revelation of the Hunt-Liddy burglary, Byrne reissued his earlier demand. Hey, guys, you and the government produce any information concerning electronic surveillance. Again, prosecutors denied any tapping of their phones. But as I just had mentioned, the prosecutors simply did not know because they were being kept out of the loop. However, later that evening, the president went before national TV and announced that he was accepting the resignations of Haldeman and Ehrlichman. And from the distance of 50 years, I think this was a disastrous choice by the president. But can't go backwards, because he's going to lose two very loyal and competent people, and he's about to take on two very self-serving individuals. Put that here. Oh, what did I do? I lost the thing here. Excuse me, everybody. I don't know why I lost that here. I hit the wrong button. There we go. In retrospect, Linderman said here, went too far. In that same announcement, the president said he was relieving Richard Kleindienst of his responsibilities as Attorney General. And as I hinted or mentioned before, this was another of a terrible decision that the president made on his own behalf, because Kleindienst had been serving him well. But Nixon thought, maybe I just need to clear the decks on all of this and give a fresh start to things. And as I said, his replacement in this position would prove to be disastrous. How so? Well, Nixon appointed Elliot Richardson, who would be appointed to be special prosecutor, empowered to appoint a special prosecutor for Watergate-related matters. And this is what's going to harm the president so much. Now, Richardson is he's a clean-cut Republican. He had served many, leadership positions for various administrations. I think he was looking forward to the day in which he himself could run as a Republican candidate for presidency. And I asked myself why he took this position. I don't know, but he did. And however, in the president's next breath about the resignation of Haldeman and Dean and of Kleindienst stepping down and replacing him with Richardson, the president announced the resignation of John Dean. And as I hinted, once again, Nixon played into Dean's hands, giving him fuel for asserting that Haldeman and Ehrlichman were involved in the conspiracy. I'm resigning when they're resigning. We were all part of the thing. I was just following orders, baby. Let's move on to another focus here. Witness for the prosecution in costume. Well, the espionage and conspiracy trial of Ellsberg and Russo in the Pentagon Papers case was in its closing days of April 25th when a surprise prosecution witness entered. And both Russo and Ellsberg, they were being charged under the Espionage Act. And the judge, if they were found guilty, they could be sentenced for years in prison, federal penitentiary. But here we have a surprise witness that comes for the prosecution. Who is it? And guess who? It was General Alexander Haig. And he showed up in uniform with his chest full of medals and stars on his shoulder boards. By the way, the president had recently promoted him to 4 stars. Haig took the stand briefly as a government rebuttal witness whose role was to attack the credentials of 2 defense witnesses. Now, Haig did not testify that he had known one of these defense witnesses, Morton Halpern, who was on the National Security Council, working for Henry Kissinger, and that is Halpern, who was among those being wiretapped by the White House in 1969. We referred to this at the very beginning, back in part 1, that there was this massive wiretapping campaign led by the White House, directed by the president, approved by John Mitchell and J. Edgar Hoover. And the person who was receiving and overlooking at all the logs from these wiretapping, about 17 people, was none other than General Alexander Haig. Haig did not reveal that he'd seen the fruits of the wiretapping against Halpern, which tracked phone conversations with Daniel Ellsberg. To have revealed that information, of course, would have blown the case sky high, and more to the point, it would have damaged himself in the process. Haig denied under oath that he had any evidence that was material to the trial, though it should be noted that he had not been asked specifically about an Ellsberg-Halpern tap. And I guess so he was just, playing that Bill Clinton game of just, they got to ask me a very direct question, otherwise I'm going to dance around it. Well, Haig was only in the courtroom for about 35 minutes. And after that appearance right there, the secret of the wiretapping and Haig's role in it will remain hidden. Okay? Well, let's take a little closer look here at the rise of Alexander Haig in the White House. You remember that wonderful phrase of his after President Reagan had been shot and Vice President Bush was out of town. Haig was in the White House in the Situation Room and says, "I'm in charge here." Well, Haig is in charge at this moment. Because with the departure of Haldeman and Ehrlichman on April 30th, President needed a new chief of staff. And foolishly, Haldeman recommended Haig, who had been serving as an assistant to Kissinger. On May 3rd, Haig came in for an interview with the president. Now, coincidentally, Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein, they published a story that had the effect of shielding Haig from the White House scandal, wiretap scandal, that was about to be exposed. Now, let's, for a little background here, so we understand the severity of this. The roots of the story went back to February of '73, when Time magazine broke the news that between '69 and '71, 6 or 7 reporters and an undisclosed number of White House officials had had their phones wiretapped. Now, in response to the Time stories, denials were immediately coming from the White House and from Gregg, who was still in service then, and whose confirmation hearings were about to open. And Woodward and Bernstein, they'd been writing on Watergate since the summer of '72, and they developed contacts with prosecutors, FBI, and what I love to call other sources. The most important other source was an official who would later be dubbed Deep Throat, and Woodward consulted with Deep Throat often in September and October in '72. So that's when he was getting a lot of contact. And then it dropped off. In late '73, Woodward was contacted out of the blue again, telling him, Colson and Mitchell were behind the Watergate operation. They were the sponsors of the burglars. So here comes Deep Throat, who'd been quiet for about 3 months, and now he comes out making this accusation about Colson and Mitchell. I want to show this photograph here. May seem curious to many of you or not. This is a still image from the movie Deep Throat. Now, the whole gag behind Deep Throat, and the movie Deep Throat was showing in Washington, D.C. at this time, and it was hugely popular. It was a movie that cost about $75,000 to produce, and it generated somewhere close to $300 million in box office. Well, the gag is our lead character right here, played by Linda Lovelace, could not experience a sexual orgasm. So she went to the doctor. The doctor gave her an exam. He said, I've got the secret. Your clitoris isn't in your vagina, it's in your mouth. And this is the moment when that discovery was made. So I thought to use this, just a little bit of humor as we go through talking about Deep Throat. Well, unable to corroborate Deep Throat's story, Woodward and Bernstein didn't publish it. And it's a good thing they didn't. But because neither Colson or Mitchell had anything to do with the break-in. But the Time wiretap story, they're feeling the heat from competition here in late February, they'd been scooped. And Woodward immediately contacted Deep Throat again. Now, Deep Throat confirmed that, yes, there had been wiretapping, but get this, he characterized it as having been conducted as, out-of-channel vigilante squads. If you want to consider the President of the United States, John Mitchell, and Henry Kissinger as out-of-channel vigilante squad, okay. So what was being fed to Woodward is misinformation by this character. It's called Deep Throat. Now, Deep Throat's description of the 69-71 wiretapping was a mixture of partial truths and of information so distorted that it smacked of deliberate misdirection. And I'll explain why I'm going into detail here in just a moment. Deep Throat misled Woodward to think Haldeman spurred Mitchell to move the vigilantes, that is, Libby and Hunt, out of the White House and into the committee to reelect. And as we've seen in our this exploration, part 1 and a little bit of part 2, that isn't what happened at all. We know that, G. Gordon Liddy was asked to go over to the committee to reelect by John Dean and Jeb Magruder because they needed an attorney over there. And nobody else wanted to go. And he was promised that you would be able to do special operations. So that's why Liddy went over, Liddy went over there. And he later took along Hunt from the Special Investigative Unit because they were able to do things. And this had nothing to do with Haldeman, nothing to do with Mitchell. So why is Deep Throat giving this false information? Well, Deep Throat further led Woodward to think that Liddy and Hunt were the perpetrators of the wiretapping, and they had nothing to do with it. But they're trying to misdirect the lead reporter on this story for the Washington Post to present that as what's going on and to take the Hunt away from where it really belongs. Deep Throat married national security wiretapping to the campaign intelligence operation, and he attributed it all to Liddy and Hunt, two low-level operatives who had no control over anything. But I dare say, in the minds of many people, this accusation stuck, and that Liddy and Hunt deserve all the blame for what happened in Watergate. But in fact, as I've mentioned, the wiretapping on the National Security Council, 1970, 69, 70, 71, was initiated at the highest level. The president, his national security advisor, and his then director of the FBI. And here's what's key. It was all supervised by Alexander Haig from the White House and by William Sullivan at the FBI, and it was all condoned by then Attorney General John Mitchell. This was all seen as national security because someone is leaking information, and we've got to find out who that is. And we suspect that it's someone on Kissinger's staff who's talking to reporters. So the Woodward and Bernstein story of May 3rd, which was based on inaccurate information, will take the focus away from Alexander Haig, and it's going to put it on Liddy and Hunt, just as Alexander Haig was being interviewed for chief of staff. So the president has called Haig in at May. He offers him the position, and the next day, Haig started on the job. He would now wield power in a way that he had once envisioned for what he termed new breed of soldier. I'm a new breed of soldier. Well, I'm at the back. I think I went too far on that. There we go. Well, having served in the White House for years, Haig knew many of the most closely held secrets of the president. He knew about the 69 through 70 wiretap. He knew about the formation of the plumbers. He knew the details of the Moore Radford scandal. He knew the foreign policy initiatives made through the military backed. He knew it all. What could he do with this information? What would he want to do with it? Well, I'm going to postulate, as Len Kolodny and Robert Gitlin do, that Haig was actually Deep Throat. And as Deep Throat, he could do a lot of damage. At this moment, it should be recalled that Haig and Woodward had a long relationship before Watergate. Here is a photograph of Bob Woodward when he's still in the Navy. As Lieutenant, Woodward had been a briefer to several high-level officers, including General Haig during 69-70. So he had a long-standing relationship with Haig and others. I think it is reasonable to consider that Haig, as Deep Throat, led Bob Woodward toward Lydian Hunt and away from himself at this crucial moment. Again, looking backwards, while Deep Throat had gone silent for 3 months, because he was very active during September and October of 72, he suddenly went very quiet until pursued by Woodward. The source suddenly revealed to Woodward that campaign funds had been used for the break-in at the DNC. Again, very incriminating information against the White House. Woodward and Bernstein reported this in a story September 17th, this is in 72, and 4 days later, Woodward was in contact with Deep Throat again. On this occasion, Woodward met with his source in the early morning hours at an underground parking garage. And for those of you, and I'm sure each of us have seen the film of All the President's Men, and that, very ominous, suspenseful scene where played by Hal Holbrook in the garage. Robert Redford meets with him, and he's wondering, am I going to get out of here alive? At that meeting, Deep Throat told Woodward more of what he had alluded to in September, that is, the extent of the campaign's intelligence gathering activities. Deep Throat said that Mitchell was behind the Watergate break-in and other illegal activity. And I hold that Mitchell had nothing to do with this. But here is Deep Throat, and there's no evidence that Mitchell had anything to do with it. But here is this character of Deep Throat saying that he is. Well, where did this Deep Throat come up with it? Well, this information, as I note here, wildly inaccurate, but these disclosures reflected White House thinking in the fall of 72, thinking to which Alexander Haig would have been privy. At this time, that is fall 72, the president was riding high because of his major success in foreign policy and his arms control initiative, and he's looking to sail right into a landslide at the November election. These initiatives, of course, referring back to rapprochement with China, détente with the Soviet Union, and pulling down American troop levels in Southeast Asia, had been opposed by the military as giving away too much to the Soviets, to the Chinese, and he's over there colluding with the enemy in Hanoi. Well, it appeared to be important to Deep Throat to try and tar Nixon just before the election. In the fall, Haig was scheduled to leave the White House, assume the position of Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. Nixon's on his way to an election victory. Revelations of dirty tricks might have the effect of weakening the president's post-election influence. Desired outcome from someone seeking to enlarge the role of the military by dampening Nixon's influence. Again, this begs the question, well, why would someone whose career benefited from Nixon now seek to weaken him? Well, perhaps there was a loyalty to an organization other than the presidency. You'll remember this motto. This is the motto of West Point: duty, honor, and coming in third, country. So that's the value system that Alexander Haig was all about. To secure the post of Vice Chief of the Army, Haig had to go through a Senate confirmation hearing. And for these, Fred Bizard served as his personal counsel. Now, we'll remember Fred Bizard. He also is a graduate of West Point. and he later served as counsel for the Army in the Pentagon. No hard questions were asked of Haig during the Senate confirmation, and Haig was easily confirmed. So he had been prepped just properly. But Haig did not immediately take up this post. This is all before becoming chief of staff. The president asked him, hey, hang around here in the White House. I want to participate in the last round of talks with North Vietnamese in Paris. Haig finally transferred out of the White House and back over to the Pentagon in January of 73. But the president continued to beckon him back to the Oval Office for discussions about foreign policy. Nixon had, he had an addiction toward having Haig around, even if he was ill-served by him. However, 4 months later, as we've just been going over, the president would bring Haig back to the White House in the most crucial position as chief of staff. So Haig merely went out of the White House as Army chief of staff, and then he's called right back. And Haig settled into the job as if he were commander taking charge of a besieged military outpost. He even continued to wear his uniform to the job every day. Hey, I didn't earn these stars for nothing, baby. Let's look at another aspect of our story here. I like to call it wire, not tapped, but wire trapped. And in this case, the lie is exposed. Well, during the week that Haig assumed authority in the White House, the wiretap scandal broke wide open. Acting director of the FBI, this is just for a few months in the aftermath of L. Patrick Gray's departure, this new gentleman, William Ruckelshaus, spurred his staff, and indeed they located the logs of the wiretaps in a safe belonging to John Ehrlichman. Now, these logs were conveyed to Judge Byrne here in Los Angeles in the Ellsberg and Russo case. And he used these logs as the basis for dismissing the government's prosecution. As you'll remember, a short while ago, Byrne is asking the prosecutors, have you guys been doing any electronic? No, sir, we haven't. Have you sure you haven't been doing it? No, sir, we haven't. Even had Haig come in and say, no, none of me know. And yet here comes documented proof that yes, we were spying on Ellsberg and in his phone conversations with Morton Halpern. So this just queered the case, and he said, the government's behavior in this is just so egregious, I'm throwing the case out. And Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony LaRusso walked away. It's a great day for the two of them, I'll tell you. Because here's what was revealed. The government had wiretapped some 17 people over a period of 22 months during 69 through 71. But interestingly, Haig's role in this wiretapping continued to remain hidden. Somebody's looking out for this guy. Well, as soon as he came into the office, Haig pushed out all of his former rivals on Kissinger's staff. Because you'll remember that when Haig was serving as a military adjutant to the National Security Council, but now that he's come back into the White House as chief of staff to the president, he's going to clean house on that National Security Council. He also became more of a guardian to the president than Bob Haldeman had ever been. Now, you'll remember that Haldeman and Ehrlichman were often referred to as the Berlin Wall because of their demand of keeping certain people away from Nixon. But as we're seeing right here, Haig is even more severe than that. No one got to see Nixon except through Alexander Haig. Haig also asked the Pentagon's chief counsel, Fred Bizarre, to come to the White House and assist Nixon's former law partner, Len Garment, in handling the president's defense. And boy, is this going to mess things up. Now, Len Garment, just a little background here, as I mentioned in part one, he had been a law partner for Nixon in New York, along with John Mitchell. And while a Democrat, he liked Nixon and was very supportive of him. And Nixon had brought him in to be his White House counsel and to serve as his defender. Alexander Haig comes in here and says, I think we can use a little help from the Pentagon. And he brings over Fred Bizard. And I think Fred Bizard is primarily going to be looking out for the Pentagon, not for the president, as we shall see. You'll remember it was Fred Bizard that demanded a new interview of Admiral Wellender that removed Haig's name from any of the, Admiral Robinson, who removed Haig's name from anything to do with the Moore-Radford affair. Oh, there, as a reminder, Buzzard and Haig had a long association. Both knew of the burial of the Moore-Radford scandal, and, as I noted, Buzzard had removed Haig from the second Wellender confession. Haig and Buzzard sat down with the president on May 9th, and it was agreed that Buzzard would maintain his current position as general counsel for the Pentagon while he moonlighted for the White House. Now, what's that about? You're working for the Pentagon, but you're going to moonlight for the White House? Whose side are you on, boy? In this capacity, Buzzard, and by extension Alexander Haig, would remain in control of crucial files that are dangerous to our new chief of staff. Buzzard's arrival resulted in Len Garment's eclipse. Garment was the lead attorney, but when Buzzard comes over, he's going to be sidelined. The White House attorney did not see Nixon for an entire month after this. And when he did, he was never alone with him. He would never be alone with Nixon again as his attorney. Let's change the focus here a little bit. A change going to come, and not always for the better. Under Haig, the day-to-day operation of the White House changed from what it had been under Haldeman. Al tightly controlled each thing. I mean, Al got much heavier involved in policy. Al was trying to manage the whole thing personally. Well, when Haig learned at a meeting that a decision had been made without consulting him, he began pounding the table with his fist, and he said 2 or 3 times, I am the chief of staff. I make all the decisions in the White House. How'd you like to have that as a supervisor, huh? Haig's heavy hand meshed with the increasing difficult times to heighten the president's isolation. And that's what's beginning to happen here. The president is going to become more and more isolated, and the decisions that the president makes will become more and more self-destructive. Often, Nixon would sit alone in his office, fire roaring, and I love this dichotomy, the fire roaring and the air condition running. Of course, he had a yellow tablet and a pencil in hand, but he was unwilling to see anyone. He became very isolated. The irony of Richard Nixon is that he had little trust in a lot of people, and he put too much trust in too few people. And one of those people he put too much trust in, Alexander Haig. Now, Stephen Bull, who served as a day-to-day administrator for the president's office from February 73 through August 74, he took over the role of Alexander Butterfield. He watched with dismay as Haig allowed the president to become isolated. Haig at one point said, if you think this president can run the country with Al Haig, you are mistaken. Well, the president trusted Haig and became dependent on him, but Haig didn't trust the president. Certainly not enough to tell him of the relationship that he had enjoyed with Bob Woodward. See, Bob Woodward's always writing these stories. He didn't tell the president, and the president, of course, reading them and becoming infuriated and say, where are they getting this information? He didn't happen to mention to, well, I knew Bob Woodward. To have done so would have gotten him fired. Let's take a little bit of a side note right here, and then we'll take a break. It's going to seem like a tangent, but it really is key to something. I call it the return of the White Knight, where Dawn Stewart shakes up the White House. Now, on May 14th, the Pentagon's top civilian investigator, Dawn Stewart, reached out for help in finding a new assignment in the government. Now, you'll remember that 6 months earlier, he had been elevated to the post of Inspector General of the Defense Investigative Service, and this is as a result of having helped locate and unearth the source of the spy operation against the president, the Yeoman Radford in the Moore-Radford affair. But now he wants to get out of the Defense Department. Why is that? Well, recent events had disturbed Stewart because the man who had pulled the confession, that is himself, from Charles Radford, shown here in the photograph, he stayed on top of the spy case as best he could. In his career as an investigator in the Pentagon, Stewart had frequently been at odds with his Defense Department General Counsel, Fred Bazard. Bazard, former military officer turned lawyer, he viewed each investigation as simply a political problem to be managed, whereas Stewart, a former FBI agent, approached each case as something to be solved, with the wrongdoers punished and national security secrets to be protected at all costs. So this is a good guy. He's not trying to compromise himself or those with him for political expediency. Well, seeking a way out of DOD, Stewart called the White House and asked to speak with David Young. That's the person he worked with on the Moore-Radford investigation. But David Young was gone, and Stewart was shunted to an aide of Len Garment instead. Well, in this conversation with this aide, Stewart expressed his frustration with the investigation that they did not result in punishment for the culprits. Stewart was especially irked that none of the people in the Moore-Radford scandal had been punished. He was additionally angered that Bazard had been elevated as a special counsel to the White House while he's still working for the Pentagon. What's going on with this? He's seeing a lot of compromise, and he doesn't like it. Now, the aide to whom Stewart was revealing himself, guess what? He sent a memo to Len Garment. And Garment acted quickly. He didn't understand the infighting that was taking place right here, the political context of it. And within days, all of Stewart's files were seized by the White House. We've got a loose cannon over there, baby. We got to get control. Well, following that, Stewart found that he was given very little work to do. So, those of you who've been in DC, you know the drill that's going on. Again, looking backwards, Stewart was nearing retirement. He needed 2 years. He just didn't want to spend those 2 years with DOD. And he communicated to anyone who would listen that he needed another job. As a last resort, he would take a job with a congressional committee. In that position, he might be required to reveal what he knew about Moore-Radford scandal, however. But he didn't want to do that. In the White House, Zart and Garment heard about these noises coming from Stewart, and they heard these noises as an attempt at blackmail. Garment contacted recently confirmed Attorney General Elliot Richardson, and he urged him to investigate Stewart and determine if he should be prosecuted for criminal conduct. Look at how these guys are operating. The one good guy, and they want to take him down. The information, however, was passed on to Justice Department Chief of the Criminal Division, we talked about earlier, Henry Peterson here. And Henry, he has no dog in the fight. He reviewed it and he said, hey, there's no criminal case to be made from this. And he threw it back. Nonetheless, Elliot Richardson all but rejected Peterson's response, and he scribbled a note to an aide asking whether Stewart could be charged with, hey, can we get him for extortion? Or can we get him for blackmail? Garment knew that Stewart was not blackmailing anyone, but Garment believed that it would be calamitous for the country to have the Moore Radford issue come out. So that's what they're all trying to do. They're still trying to keep Moore Radford buried. Alexander Haig also believed this. Can't let that thing get out. Congress might use this information in a vendetta against the Joint Chiefs and would result in undue interference in military affairs. And these were just better left to the president. Eventually, the attempt to prosecute Stewart would come to an end, but Moore Radford scandal seemingly would not stay buried. It's like the undead. The columnist Jack Anderson, whose earlier column had unleashed the whole Moore Radford affair, wrote an article that inflamed the embers of the scandal. Two members on the minority staff of the Senate committee asked Stewart to respond to questions. Stewart readily told them that the India-Pakistan story was much bigger than what Jack Anderson had described, and he said it involved a grave episode. That is the spy scandal. Now, Senator Howard Baker, a Republican member of the Senate committee investigating Watergate, he thought, hey, let's get into this Moore Radford. Let's explore that. But no matter what he did, he tried to do a great deal. No one within the administration would discuss Moore Radford. So Senator Baker there was shut down. And so that issue, that is the Moore Radford scandal, would remain buried, covered up, if you will. So some of these things that we discussed at the very beginning refuse to die, and they keep coming back and haunting some of the key players here. All right, let's take a few moments here, and those of you that need to go away, do so. I'll stand by, and those of you that have questions, I'll try to address them. No, go ahead, Rob.
Do you think that Nixon ever realized after he left office that he had sort of been railroaded?
That's an interesting idea. I think Nixon spent a lot of time trying to rationalize and explain the situation. I think John Ehrlichman realized it. I think, Chuck Colson, Barbara, though she's not with us today, mentioned a book that she's been reading by Chuck Colson, and Chuck Colson certainly thinks that. I'm not sure that some of them could either lived long enough or had the distance of time to begin to appreciate what had happened. So I can't answer authoritatively about Nixon's position on what happened to himself. I'll tell you, just as an aside here, Saturday, I took a group from one of our local colleges out to the Nixon Library and Museum. And of course, I do a very curated tour through it. I focus on very specific things. And the hardest exhibit for me to go through is the Watergate Gallery, because I find that once upon a time, I thought everything in there was correct. And today I go down the hall and I said, that they got wrong. They're misleading the public on that. This is wrong. And so I just have to shut my mouth. And we have, but one thing that what I'm leading to, you come to a gallery, they talk about Nixon as a element in pop culture. And after he left office, he was interviewed by David Frost. Now, he got a big fee for that interview, but that interview was very telling. And we'll recall some of the famous phrases that Nixon has from it. The big one is, if the president does it, it's not illegal. And I think a lot of people would take issue with that. I think he was
Not today. No, not today. No, not today. That's what the Supreme Court just ruled.
If the president does it, it's okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's good. Thank you, Margaret. Yeah. Nixon just needed another Supreme Court.
Or he needed to be later on
Yeah.
in the years.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, when I'm doing that excursion, I start in the middle of the museum where they deal with his childhood. I think they put all of it, when you begin the way the foundation has established the galleries, you start with him coming into office and all the big issues and things that he was trying to handle as president. So you're dealing with Nixon as president in 69. And then you end that first half with Watergate. Well, I come to right where Watergate ends, and there you start with Nixon as a young man growing up in Yorba Linda, because the museum is on the property where his father had a failed citrus farm, and from there they moved to Whittier, lived in a small home that his father was responsible for, and they've moved it onto the lot. And I take people through his Nixon as a young man because I think the things that we learn about him are so important for understanding Nixon, the person. And we take him through his childhood, going to school, going off to Duke Law School, and then coming back and working in a small firm in Whittier because nobody in New York hired him. And then the outbreak of the war and him enlisting and going back to DC. And because of his education, his legal background, he was expected to oversee contracts, but he wanted to be closer to the front line. So he was transferred into the South Pacific, but he was kept far from the front line. He was a supply officer, albeit in one of the island chains at that time. But he served him, Nixon served really well. And he was very popular among the people who were with him. He came back, and the Republican movers and shakers in Whittier, they were looking for someone who might run against a Democrat incumbent, Jerry Voorhees, who'd been in office for 5 terms, I think. And Nixon said, I'll do it. And two things that I feel like I'm going on and on here about Nixon as a young man here. But there are 2 people who are not mentioned in the museum. And one of these is a gentleman named Murray Chotiner, who was a political strategist who helped Nixon in that first race and all of his subsequent races up to his vice presidency run. And Murray was so consequential in Nixon's political ascendancy, but you never find his name on the wall because Murray used to play lots of Murray knew how to play a hardball politics, and they want to make it seem as if Nixon just, rose just from the whatever. The other person who isn't mentioned is a writer for the Los Angeles Times. His name was Kyle Palmer. He was known as Mr. Republican, and he held a tremendous amount of influence in state politics here in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And he groomed Nixon for his runs for the Congress and then for the Senate. And he also secured the endorsement of the Los Angeles Times. Los Angeles Times at that period was a Republican. It was a very parochial paper and very conservative, led by the Chandler family. And their employee, Kyle Palmer, he essentially handed the endorsement to Nixon from them. but you'll never see those two names at the museum. So I bring those kinds of things forward for people to understand, how could this young man who had such low self-esteem rise to this position? It's because he got a lot of help. Anybody else? Anything? Kathy, Bob, anything at this time? Penny, anything for you, baby? All right.
Okay. Yeah, I did have a
Oh.
question. It seems like we just have a different standard of morality today than we did back then, because all of this stuff, if it was happening today, everybody would just seem to like, okay. And I mean, they would just say, well, okay, that's government for you. And back then it was a really big deal. I mean, all the things that come, like the things that are going on today with a felon running for president. I mean, that would have been horrible back in that day, and that would have been. I mean, it seems like none of this was as important. It was very important during the time because I remember it, but that seemed like if it happened today, it would be anything that would have caused his resignation.
Yeah. One thing I'll also mention along with that, I have it here. One thing I have to be careful I don't go too far into this thing. As he served in the Congress as a congressman, and then when the opportunity rose to run for Senate after just 3 terms in Congress, he was running against a very popular California Democratic Congresswoman, that's Helen Gahagan Douglas, for a vacated seat. And he was accused of dirty tricks. Now, Nixon wasn't doing anything that anybody else wasn't doing, but Nixon just, that label stuck with him. And it was some of the campaign activities that Murray Chotiner was devising that got, that tarred Nixon. But out of that, Helen Gahagan Douglas, she referred to Nixon as Tricky Dick. And that nom de politique stuck. And he bore that to the rest of his life. But while as a senator, you may remember, he became very suspicious of a State Department employee whose name just went out of my brain here at the moment. Oh, I can't think of his name. Anyway, I don't want to belabor it, except to say that Nixon was like a dog with a bone. He said, this guy, there's something that isn't right about this guy. And everybody else in the Senate, Democrats included, said, he's a good guy. Why are you going after him? Anyway, Nixon pursued this case. It's the famous case. Anyway, Nixon, even though Nixon was right, it was a Pyrrhic victory because he made so many opponents through this pursuit. And that leads to when he was selected by Eisenhower to be his running mate in the 52 campaign, he was doing a West Coast campaign tour, and suddenly an issue arose out of an article in a paper saying that Nixon had a secret campaign fund. Well, he had a campaign fund, that's his money held over from his Senate campaign, that was used to pay some ongoing expenses. And almost every other politician had a similar campaign. But Nixon was the one whom they were holding to a different standard. And he became, I'm trying to search for a word, he was so heavily criticized by people in the nation. And, to the point that Eisenhower, kept him at arm's distance. And Nixon was saying, support me. And Eisenhower refused to support him. And he said, essentially defend yourself, Nixon. So Nixon, using money from the Republican Party, went on and gave what we now know as the Checkers speech. And it's a powerful, so many of the elites view it as a very mawkish, maudlin speech, but it was a powerful speech, and it turned the tide for Nixon. I referenced that, Penny, because Nixon was held to another standard that other people were not. And he always felt aggrieved by the fact everybody else is doing tricks during campaign. I'm the one that gets accused for them. The Kennedys are far worse than what I've done, but we haven't got to that. All right, I'll leave off of that subject and come back to 5 days in July. And these are really 5 consequential days in July of 73, and it's going to set up the president for a big fall. Well, for some time, Woodward had been pushing the Senate to interview a White House aide. That's Alexander Butterfield, who I mentioned a moment ago. And it's likely that Deep Throat was encouraging Woodward's interest in Butterfield. But we will explore Woodward's interest in Butterfield a little bit later, but I want to set that up there. At this moment, another person commands our attention. Yes, we're going to go back to John Dean. Dean appeared before the Senate committee and the national television. Now, you remember from earlier episodes that Dean wanted to turn evidence, or ostensible evidence, but he wanted immunity for it. Well, the special prosecutor was not going to give him immunity. The grand jury wasn't going to give him, and the House committee wasn't going to. But he had his lawyer, a renowned Democratic lawyer, who was associated with Senator Edward Kennedy. He was shopping John Dean's story to anybody who might consider giving him immunity. And he found a ready buyer in Sam Ervin's Senate committee. So that's where John Dean shows up. And before he does, John Dean, he goes over, he gets rid of his Gucci suit, and he goes over to Brooks Brothers. He gets rid of his contact lenses, and he starts wearing these eyeglasses that we see him in here, and he gets his hair cut. He cleaned up actually, I'm about to sneeze here, just a moment. I think John Dean totally changed his costume. I mean, this is all theater that we're witnessing right here. And also in theater, he had his newly married wife, Maureen, sitting behind him, in her outfit and her hair conservatively pulled back. And he begins to give hours worth of testimony. He said, I just needed to get all of this down in paper because I think you, the senators, deserve to hear this. As I note, he cut his hair, donned glasses, wore conservative attire. Behind him was Maureen, often the subject of photographers and television cameras. She sat in conservative clothing, poised, good-looking, blonde, her hair piled on top of her head. All theater. It's all for the cameras to change the minds of America, or to form the opinion of the American people. As her husband of 8 months poured out his story, she appeared to pay attention, but not betray any emotion. And Dean's testimony was extremely detailed because it had to be. His picture had to be complete in order to be thoroughly convincing. And Dean was in a perfect position to draw that picture because he had known all of what was going on during the planning for the break-ins and the cover-up. Dean alone had all of the information. In his testimony, Dean implicated Mitchell, reluctantly it seemed, and more readily aimed allegations at John Ehrlichman, Bob Haldeman, and at the president. Dean went easy on Magruder and Strawn, only bringing them in when he had to, and all the while being careful lest he anger them unduly, because both of them knew how dirty John Dean was. Dean didn't want to provoke them to the sort of detailed recollections of what had happened that would have revealed to the Senate committee Dean's own complicity and his role as the central instigator. Get this, although here comes my sneeze. So I think it feels it's just on the verge, and then it doesn't come. The committee bought Dean lock, stock, and barrel precisely because He was an arrow that pointed upward in the direction that they were looking. They were looking to get the president, and that's what they wanted. What did the president know, and when did he know it? Now, we're hearing, this is a famous question by a Republican member of the committee, James Baker. Now, Baker's up there. He's not trying to, be disloyal to the president, but he's having to watch his back a little bit because he senses the mood in the nation is turning against the president. The Democrats, who control that House of Congress, both houses of Congress at this moment, have a lot of influence on the Senate Investigative Committee. Later, in their own testimony, that Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell seemed to offer to the committee, all these seemed just to be denials that rang hollow because, one, they weren't as densely detailed as Dean's accusations. So they are going to be before the Senate committee, but the Senate committee is not going to believe them, unfortunately. These men did have documents, but Mitchell's logs were ignored, and notes of Haldeman and Ehrlichman were deemed self-serving, as if what John Dean was presenting wasn't. The committee ignored Strawn's offer of documents that showed Dean handled political intelligence at the White House. There were many holes in Dean's stories and logical inconsistencies, but few of these holes and inconsistencies were closely scrutinized by the Senate committee. They were looking past John Dean. They were looking to get right to Richard Nixon. The senators and staff, as I said, they were looking for the president. Garment, that is the president's attorney, he prepared a memo about John Dean, which bore the in-house name of Golden Boy. The Golden Boy memo noted many instances where Dean's story was contradicted by sworn testimony, by documents, and simple logic. But once again, I should say, in one instance, the memo was flawed by the assertion that John Mitchell, as well as John Dean, was culpable, and Mitchell was not. The Golden Boy assault on Dean's credibility, however, soon faded. It was reduced in the press and in the senators' minds just to the status, an attempt to throw mud at this witness. Following Dean at the witness table, there's a parade of current and former Nixon administration officials, but they stonewalled. Their stories conflict with one another, and they didn't lead the committee any further towards solving what had happened during Watergate. And the television ratings of the hearings started to decline. Uh-oh, that's serious. After July 4th, the hearings were beginning to bog down. Some committee members were concerned that at the end of the testimony, they might be left with just a series of charges, but no proof of culpability on the part of the president or his chief aides. On July 5th, however, committee staff talked to Larry Higby, formerly chief aide to Bob Haldeman, who knew about the taping system in the White House. Now, Higby received advice from Haldeman that if the question of the tapes came up, he was to claim he can't talk about it. At this point, Haldeman had already listened to some of the tapes at the president's request. That's going to see a mistake, but let's go on. The committee staff asked Higby about the tapes, and he tried to deflect the question by telling them, the president, at the end of the day, he just dictated notes to himself on tape, but the staffers weren't interested in his dictative belt recordings and asked, are there any other tapes that you are aware of? Higby whispered to his lawyer that he'd been told to claim executive privilege on that question, and then he proceeded to finesse the question and not mention that claim. Higby successfully completed his interview with the staff without spilling the secret. I went the next day to Haig. I told him, Al, they're eventually going to get to the taping system. Well, Hal responded that the committee already knew about the dicta belt, but Higby said they're not interested on the dicta belts. They're interested in the secret taping system, okay? Haig seemed surprised to learn of this taping system, and Higby laid out its dimensions, after which Haig looked at me and said, I'll get back to you. Higby fully expected Haig to tell him, as Haldeman had, that if asked about the taping system, he was to say, hey, it's covered by executive privilege and I can't talk about it. But the advice he received from Haig wasn't what he had expected. He got back to me the next day and he said, tell the truth, meaning tell the committee about the tapes. Higby was shocked. He believed that the instruction had come from Nixon, so he was prepared to testify fully if the right question was asked. So here comes Butterfield, making a mess. A week after Higby's appearance, committee investigators called Alexander Butterfield. On the afternoon of July 13th, Butterfield sat down with the investigators. And it was at this meeting that Butterfield revealed the existence of the White House taping system, the fruits of which eventually will lead to the end of Nixon's administration. During these days in July 73, the fortunes of the president regarding Watergate changed dramatically. And the reasons can be found in the actions of Alexander Haig and Fred Bazard, with the unwitting assistance of Lynn Garment. But it all begins with Butterfield. This is interesting because I had mentioned, how these people end up working on the White House staff. When a new president comes in and and people in the top positions are hired, everybody that may have known them 20 years before gets on the phone and said, hey, can I get a job over there? We saw that happen with E. Howard Hunt to Chuck Colson. And same thing happened with Butterfield, who only casually had known Haldeman at UCLA, and yet he reached out to him 20 years later for a White House position when Haldeman was made chief of staff in '69. Well, during his first year serving administration, Butterfield had almost daily contact with the president, as his role was to take notes and handle paperwork. In his second year, Butterfield picked up some of Haldeman's responsibilities in responding to the president's moment-to-moment requests. In that new role, Butterfield had a workspace adjoining the Oval Office. He was the first person to see the president in the morning and the last person to see him at night. Powerful place. In February '71, Butterfield learned the president wanted to tape conversations and meetings. And as I mentioned to you before, the reason Nixon wants to tape these conversations is because he didn't want Henry Kissinger stealing the fire from all these major foreign policy initiatives. He wanted to take these systems, these tapes with him when he stepped down from the White House and write books about them. As I note here, he wished to do so for historical purposes. Butterfield turned to the Technical Security Division of the Secret Service and its chief, Alfred Wong, I'd mentioned him earlier, who brought in several electronics experts to install the system. According to Butterfield, who knew of the system when it was first established, including himself, the president, Haldeman, Higby, Wong, and several Secret Service, and that's it. That's all who knew about it. Now, as I mentioned also, the phone had a microphone on it at the desk, the Resolute desk that the president used in the Oval Office. It had microphones. If you went over to the president's office and the executive office, there's also a microphone, but they were of a lesser quality. The worst quality of all were at Camp David. Almost nothing they heard at Camp David could ever be clearly heard. The best conversations were those that were recorded on the phone. Later, Butterfield would inform his secretary and the person who replaced him in the White House, Stephen Bull. So Butterfield was there at the beginning, and he informed Stephen Bull about this after Butterfield would take a position with the FAA. When Haig moved to the White House in '73, Butterfield told him as chief of staff about the taping system. Haig answered, "Oh, I know about that." Of course, this raises a question about Haig's astonishment when Higbee told him of the taping system in July. Yeah, what's going on there, Alexander? At this time, Butterfield had left the White House and was serving in the FAA. He'd been scheduled to travel out of Washington on that Friday, but he agreed, on that weekend, but he agreed to meet with investigators on a Friday afternoon, but I got to be out of town here. In advance of this meeting, Butterfield decided to reveal the existence of the taping system, but only if he was asked a direct question about it. And during his closed-door interview with Senate investigator, Butterfield was asked, did Dean have any reason to believe that he was being taped? At a crossroads, Butterfield decided to give the complete answer. No, Dean did not know about the taping system, but all of the president's conversations were recorded. Well, following this testimony, Butterfield was informed that, hey, you're going to be likely to be called back to face the full Senate committee, perhaps as early as Monday, to answer similar questions. At that very moment, the president, and this is key, the president was in Bethesda Naval Hospital suffering from viral pneumonia. Earlier that day, he had a tense conversation with Senator Ervin regarding the committee's request for White House papers that might relate to the investigation. The president refused to turn over the papers, citing executive privilege. Despite being hospitalized, the president believed that he was on top of the day's events, but during the weekend, he remained completely unaware that his political fate was being undermined. If this story broke while he was still at the White House, he'd have been able to handle it, but he's over in the hospital when this breaks. After Butterfield's testimony, Democratic and Republican investigative staffers ran to their respective bosses to reveal what they had learned. The one person who was not informed about the revelation was the president himself. Had the president been informed on Friday and the following weekend, that it would have allowed him to mount a defense, namely a written directive saying that the taping system was covered by executive privilege. And hence, Butterfield could not answer questions about it to the committee. While there is no record to document this, it's reasonable, I think, to presume that Butterfield contacted Haig the day following his interview and told him of his mishap. In the meantime, someone contacted Woodward at the Post to inform him of this revelation. While this informant could have been Haig, it's reasonable to presume that this information came from Woodward's own friend, Scott Armstrong, who was serving on the committee. On Sunday, Haig, Bizart, and Garment met in the White House on Sunday to determine, what do we do? Let's not tell the president. What a self-serving and stupid decision this is. Let's not tell the president. Well, why? Because we don't have all the facts. Oh, the president's ill. Well, they thought it would be protected by executive privilege, but by the time they got around to it, it would be too late to stop it. Haig met with the president multiple times during this key weekend. Haig, however, would not tell him about Butterfield's revelation until Monday morning, and then it would be too darn late. When Haig did reveal it, he tells the president that there's no way to stop it, Mr. President. In fact, there was plenty of time, plenty of precedent for the president to sign a letter to the committee and to Butterfield saying that his proposed testimony was prevented on the grounds of executive privilege. On Monday, a subpoena was issued for Butterfield to appear before the Senate committee. Butterfield did, in fact, appear and revealed his electrifying testimony. I know I watched it on television. I dare say some of you have as well. If someone had been trying to injure the president, they could not have engineered a more deleterious chain of events than these 5 days in July. Anyway, on several more occasions during the president's final year in office, similar patterns of seemingly inadvertent failures to correctly inform Nixon can be discerned. And again, it would be Haig who failed to inform the president. The Senate committee decided to subpoena the actual tapes. The White House refused to turn them over. And this is going to commence a year-long battle of the administration to withhold. And that brings us to our conclusion of today's part 3 in the tapes. So let's have a conversation, shall we? I laid a lot on you right there, as usual. Let's see what we got going here. Get this, find my cursor here, and I'll get this share stopped. There we go. There we go. Go ahead, Bob. Yes.
Now you explained what the initiation of the tapes was by Nixon, that he wanted this information for history and for his. Could you say a little more about that?
I absolutely can. When Nixon came into office, he was using this National Security Council to carry out his foreign policy that he had envisioned during the years he was in New York. He said, we've got to end this Cold War. We've got to have better relationship with China, better relationship with the Soviet Union. We've got to end this war in Vietnam. But he knew he couldn't do that through the Senate. He knew he couldn't do it through the Defense Department because they would have self-interest in keeping it going. Now, he was familiar with the National Security Council because which had come into existence under the Truman administration, but he had great familiarity with the National Security Council because he was Eisenhower's representative to it during Eisenhower's administration. So when he come, now the National Security Council had been used by Kennedy and Johnson, but not to the degree that Nixon knew that it could be. So Nixon came into office and he had formed this National Security Council with Kissinger, Henry Kissinger at its lead, and a host of people that Kissinger brought with him from Harvard. And they're the ones using this back channel to communicate with China. And we'll also see that they'll communicate with Moscow as well. But it looks like when these news of these initiatives break, it looks like Henry Kissinger, to many people in the media, looks like Henry Kissinger is the one out front. He's the one that's going to Peking. He's the one that's going to Moscow. He's the one that's going to Paris. And he's the one taking the initiative on this. And Henry doesn't dissuade anybody from thinking that. He's got a big ego. He likes to have it fed. Mm-hmm. And Nixon said, hey, wait a minute, baby. These are my ideas. I want credit for them. And when Nixon had come into office, he famously had the taping system that was in place under Johnson and under Kennedy removed. But it was an off-on switch. It didn't run continuously. If either of those presidents wanted something recorded, they flipped a switch behind the desk. Nixon, as we had discussed right here, he wanted a taping system reinstalled, but didn't want to tell anybody about it. He wanted a system that was voice activated because he couldn't handle the off-on switching. And he wanted those tapes to capture all the conversations, a significant conversations that were taking place on his telephone, in the Oval Office, and in his office across the way in the old executive office building, but also up at Camp David. The microphones that Secret Service under Albert Wong installed were in varying degrees of capability. Those in the Oval Office, on the phone and the desk, were the best. they became more degraded elsewhere. But Nixon wanted all these conversations taped so that when he left the White House, he would have great source material to say, I did this on such and such a day, I said that, so that Henry Kissinger couldn't steal his fire, couldn't take credit for this. Nixon was looking forward to his time out of office when he would be writing books and he'd be able to reference all this material on the tapes to substantiate his claim and to prevent Henry Kissinger from taking that information from him. So that's why the system went into place. He wasn't.
But there was never, you know, he would not tell people that their conversations were being taken.
No, exactly. And tell anybody. The only ones who knew were Haldeman and Butterfield, and later Higbee, and Alfred Wong, and the Secret Service men who installed it. That was it. Yeah.
And then my other question is,
go ahead.
Why couldn't he, even after he was subpoenaed for the tapes, say that it was executive privilege? Why couldn't he say then? Why did he have to, why couldn't he use that as a rationale when he was subpoenaed?
I think he could have. But he has Haldeman, his chief of staff, coming up to him and saying, it's too late, Mr. President. We can't do it right now. I think Nixon should have gotten his, one of the things, and this again is a very important, something very important to understand about Nixon. And you learn, I think we learned this. There's a book, I should have, it's not on your reading, on your source list right there. It's called Being Nixon. And I can't think of the author's name. It's by Evan Thomas. Evan really, it's so helpful to understand Nixon by understanding him as a young man. And while he could be determined student and determined to fight for certain things, he also had low self-esteem, and he would just say, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to quit. I'm going to quit. And one of the lowest moments in his life was during this accusation that I mentioned at the break right there about the secret campaign fund. And he couldn't get any support from Eisenhower. And Eisenhower basically will go out and make the case to the American people. We'll see what the American people are going to do. And Nixon said, how dare he? How dare he do that? I'm so demoralized, I want to quit. And it was Pat Nixon who said, you cannot quit. You must stand up not just for yourself, but for your families. You owe it to your daughters, because if you quit now, you will be marred with this, and we will be marred with this for the rest of our lives. And he got fired up by those remarks that she made to him. And that's in 52. So he could be fired up, but he needed someone to goad him into it. And he comes out of Bethesda Hospital. He says, I'm fine, but he's been dealing with pneumonia all weekend. Now, if they'd come to him and they told him about it, he said, we're doing executive privilege. They didn't tell him. They didn't tell him until Monday morning. And when when Haig tells him this, he said, it's too late to do anything about it now. And he was so enamored of Haig and Haig's judgment, he went along with it. A terrible decision. I think it was a terrible decision. Because Nixon, aside from a lot of other things, as I said, I've grown to have a very, very different view of Nixon as I've been reading and preparing this course right here. Nixon will often say, I'm standing here not just for myself, but for the office of the presidency. We can't have one of the other branches coming in here and demanding things of us when it is in the realm of executive privilege. But we will soon see how how his opponents on the outside, and it's primarily the Democratic Party, and as I mentioned, it is the Ted Kennedy wing of the Democratic Party that are going to come straight at him on this issue here right now. And he's going to look around. Where's my friends? And the two people that he ostensibly has in his office to defend him are compromised. I think Haig and Bazard are really looking out for the Pentagon and the DOD, they're not looking out for Richard Nixon and the presidency.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
I have a question. Have any of the presidents that followed him, have they installed any type of recording devices or anything? Or did that just absolutely like, we are not recording anything ever?
Penny, you answered your own question, baby.
Okay.
Ain't nobody on recording. I mean, if they do, everything is very secretive. But you know, just look what we've got today. So many of the things that we communicate with are on mobile devices. And mobile devices are easily, discovered. Look at that. But no, there's with the removal of the taping system under Nixon, no one has reinstalled one in the White House. But I dare say many of them would love to have one to be able to capture kind of information and look over these. One of Nixon's problems was they were recording all. As I said, these things were, they're often referred to as voice activated. They're actually noise activated. More than 200 hours of the tape at Nixon Library are of the cleaning crew coming in and vacuuming in the Oval Office. So there was there's more than 3,000 hours worth of conversation. Nixon was not listening to any of these tapes in real time. They were just moving on. The tapes would run out of tape and they'd be changed by Secret Service continually in all of these different venues. And so Nixon wasn't listening to what he was saying, particularly at crucial moments. And when we go into some of those crucial dates that the committee and the special prosecutor are going to require, he has no idea what he said in the past. And he's expecting or hoping that his legal team, Bazart and Haig, have listened to these things and give him warning about what went down in the past. And they don't do it. No.
Well, I know they wouldn't even let Obama have a cell phone. They said, no, you can't have anything. But I just wondered.
Yeah. So, Margaret, you're shaking your head there, baby. Unmute, baby.
I'm sure that there are plenty of tapes out there that we don't know about because, I mean, I think that today, especially, there are so many ways to tape that you don't need a whole system. You don't need a lot of people looking at it or seeing it. That I mean, to me, it seems logical that a lot of the things, in order to guarantee that they weren't held accountable, presidents have said, oh, I'm going to tape this, whether it's on my cell phone where people don't know, or they have some other device. And I just can't believe that in 50 years, 40 years, 30 years, it'll come out that they did have that.
It's just that no one's going to admit it right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm going to roll back to something. Each of you were with us when we were looking at the course called Infamy that looks at Roosevelt's administration and his effort to bring our nation into war. And, my whole focus on that is that while he's trying to get into war in Europe, he's got his eye on China and to get into war there. Nothing was taped, obvious. The taping, they didn't have what technology they had was insufficient. However, when all of the people, he would have a cabinet meeting, all of these guys would run home, dear diary, the president said this in the meeting today, and those records did exist, and they are so revealing to us, albeit we're getting from the perspective, whether it was Morgenthau or whether it was from his Secretary of Defense, whose name, and Secretary of State, Knox, and God, I can't think of the Secretary of Defense at that moment. They would go home and they'd write up in my dear diary, and very detailed notes of what had happened. And we, from a historical, I'm very grateful that we did. Now, most people, unless you're a researcher, are not going to go into those things to really to see what was being discussed in those cabinet meetings. But it's very helpful to have a record of what goes on.
Mhm.
Robert, you've been quiet today, baby. Nothing to say. Oh, yeah, he's in his civil service mode today, baby.
No, that's Federal Reserve is not civil service. It's
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, so no, that's just interesting. You know, Haig was a unique character. He was a brigadier. No, he wasn't. He was in charge of the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam for about a 6-month period.
Yeah.
West Point graduate. He had a big ego, big
Yeah.
super ego. So, and everyone saw that when President Reagan was shot.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it came out loud and clear. I mean, that whole day was his day, and he was masterful at it. I mean, just anyway. No, but it's interesting how there's things being taken now. You can count on it. You can bet money on things are being recorded. People just don't know about it.
Yeah.
So
As as a penny that our technology has it's so advanced today and so miniaturized that we just have we have to presume that everything we say and do is being captured, recorded, and available for the analysis anytime in the future.
I can tell you a real quick story.
Go ahead.
We had a temporary office building over in Alexandria, Virginia. And it was, we had it for about a 6-month period because we were doing some renovations on a data center back at Fed. And this building, we had a conference room that we'd go into, and it was like a skiff. It was basically secured, had leaded walls and everything. No one could listen, and you had to leave your phones outside and every kind of device. And you go in there, it was like in a soundproof room, and that's where meetings would be held. They kept it that way from the CIA, so you can imagine the kind of stuff they were doing. This is early 70s. Think about what they're doing today, the kind of technology that they're using today. And I was glad we got out of that building a couple of, 6 months later. There's just too many people watching it. So, but Woodward, and you're going to go more into Woodward?
I'll go more into Woodward. The one thing, in 2005, it's on your source list. I mentioned I mistakenly left the work about Deep Throat on there, and I didn't put Evan Thomas's on your source list, but I'll correct that. In 2005, Mark Felt published a book, and he said, I was
Right.
Deep Throat. But Mark, I think there's many instances that we can say that Mark Felt is exaggerating his influence right there.
Yeah.
And in fact is deceiving in what he is saying there. And Woodward is happy to corroborate him in this because it's covering up the more likely relationship that he had with Alexander Haig, because the kind of information that was coming from Woodward is more reasonably coming from Haig rather than Mark Felt. And Mark Felt, of course, he had no desire to bring down the president. He was angry that Nixon had appointed Gray rather than himself as the acting director of the FBI. And he was trying to embarrass Gray by these disclosures. But he was talking to a lot of people, more prominently, the writers for the Time magazine. Time magazine had far more revelations from Mark Felt than the Washington Post did.
Why would Woodward want to cover for him?
They had a long-term relationship before, well, not a long-term, but they had a relationship that existed prior to the White House. When Haig first came to the White House in 1969, it was a member of the National Security Council serving under Kissinger. And Bob Woodward was still in the military. He was in the Navy, and he was a communication officer. He had just come off of sea duty, and he was given a high-level duty at a communication center in DC. But as a related duty, he was expected to be a briefer not only are you over there watching these 20 sailors and all this high-tech information communication stuff, we want you to go over and talk to Admiral Moore. We want you to go over and talk to General Haig here and tell them about things that we're learning. Just brief them about various things here. So Woodward had established a relationship with him when he was still in the military. And he will leave the military. He will stay in a year longer than his requirement and in that position. And it will help to cement those relationships even deeper. When he leaves, he has no background in journalism whatsoever. He goes and he applies to the Washington Post, and they look at his resume and they said, get out of here. He ends up picking up a job for an affiliate newspaper of the Post in a suburban area in Maryland. I believe it's in Maryland or Virginia. It's one of Maryland or Virginia. And he was just doing local stories there. But he keeps pestering over 6 months to a year to get into Washington, to get on the Post staff. And they give him a trial. And he's awful. And that's where Carl Bernstein comes into play. Carl Bernstein comes over and sees what he's writing, and without Woodward's approval, he rewrites his article. Woodward's been in the business since he was a teenager. Woodward knows the journalism business backwards and forwards. So he knows how to write a lead, how to follow it up with the second and third graph, and then how to close it out. So he would take Woodward's stuff and rewrite it. But Woodward took great umbrage out. How dare you rewrite me? Well, you want to save your job. And so that's how Woodward, again, someone who had no journalistic background, is kind of infiltrating into the Washington Post, has his ass saved by Carl Bernstein. And then on the day of, I want to call it Monday, June 19th, this person who's doing local stories for he picks up the task, go over and cover the courtroom. I hear this a trial that's over. Now, there was another White House crime reporter that had the story before Woodward. In fact, he was in the Watergate building with the cops. The cops, hey, we got a story over, you might want to follow it. I can't think of that Washington Post reporter's name. But anyway, he handed it off, or someone handed that assignment off to Woodward to go to the courtroom on Monday morning. So he's sitting there in the courtroom when we start to hear, and this is the one in particular, when the judge asked him to James McCord, and what is your employer? Who's your employer name? Instead of saying, I'm self-employed with McCord Associates, he said, CIA. And that's all Woodward needed to hear. And he went off and running with the story then. And so he was attached to the story from that point on. But he needed Carl Bernstein to help him write. But his relationship, because they caught the attention of the establishment with those early articles, they were contacted by Haig and others for information. But most of the things that we learned about Watergate really were coming from FBI and their own investigation right there. Not, a lot of young people got into journalism because they said, I want to be Woodward and Bernstein. When in fact, most of it was done by the criminal justice system and the FBI there.
And they get all kinds of awards.
Yeah, they got all kinds of awards. But don't you think that, Woodward, he was what do you call it in the Navy? Like a second lieutenant, and then he became a lieutenant. And he left the military, as an 01 or 02, and not very high up as an officer. And again, if you're going to go into this, I don't know if you found anything. He did have some crossover with the CIA during his military career. So, think about, there might have been a few phone calls made on his behalf to get him to the Washington Post. Because,
exactly.
Anyway, I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist, but just what I know about my time back in those days, I just was surprised that, I read that book and I thought, wait a minute, it just didn't seem right.
Yeah.
you know, it's like you said, it was a lot more Bernstein because Bernstein had been trained to do that.
Right.
Do you
So-
think that perhaps Bernstein was told to help Woodward?
Oh, yeah.
Because
Well-
why else? I mean, reporters aren't known for helping other reporters out with rewriting stories and things.
Right.
I mean, that
Well-
seems a little odd.
Well, it's probably John's answer, but I'd just say this. If he was given a position at the Washington Post at the time, when what's the family name that ran the Post?
Oh,
Graham's.
Graham's, yeah. So that would have been very embarrassing for them. So they probably had Bernstein say, you know, help him write, because if they were going to fire him, there was been probably a chain of events that would have made that whole assignment to the Washington Post come out. And I don't think they wanted that, those phone calls to be recognized and heard about. So that's what I think, John.
No, I think there is substance to what the scenario that you have right there. Now, Bernstein himself was very nearly fired for insubordination, but he was a very good journalist. But marrying himself to Woodward on this story got them both locked in. And because the articles that they weren't finding out, they were going out, they did a lot of egregious, illegal things trying to build their story. And they were caught at it, and they had to be reined back in. But Bernstein, much later out of this, will write a major article for Rolling Stone magazine, in which he details the influence of the CIA in American media. And this is the most outstanding piece of work product that Bernstein ever did, because he said the CIA is all over and in every media organization we have here in the country. So the phone call that you're alluding to, I think is probably did happen. Keep this guy on there because it'll serve our interests as well as yours. Yeah. Penny, anything else from you, baby?
Yes, I would like, what do you have? Are you working on anything for the future? Any other programs?
Well, I've got funny you should ask, a course that I've proposed to OLLI at Arkansas for the winter, or in 2025. It's a course that I've taught before, albeit about 5 years ago. And you can imagine, just the title alone, it's called Ruby Ridge, Waco, Oklahoma City.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
we'll be getting into these events that took place in 93 and in 95. All of them involving alcohol, tobacco, and firearms and the FBI. And one episode will be on Ruby Ridge. We'll look at who is this family? Who are the Weavers? How did they come to be on this hillside? And why did the government need to carry out this siege against them? Then we'll look at, taking place that same year, the events in, Mount Carmel, which is a religious center outside of Waco. And it had been in existence for decades. It is an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and a very conservative organization that's out there, albeit we have a member of the Seventh-day Adventists who become its leader, but all of the participants out at Mount Carmel were there because they found him to be an inspiring teacher of one particular book from the Bible, the book of Revelation. They weren't hearing that story from anyone else. And the government, I'm kind of, so I should start up right there. I'm sort of also I start to give you. So I'll be looking at those, and we'll have each of those stories. The government has given us an official narrative that is deceitful. And I'll tell you what actually happened in each of those instances at Ruby Ridge, at Waco, and at Oklahoma City. And it's not a pretty picture.
Sounds great. Can't wait.
You just like to be stirred up, baby. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah. Margaret, any final thoughts? All right. Kathy and Robert,
Thank you.
Thank you very
John.
much.
Thanks.
welcome. It's great to be with you, and we'll see you for our concluding episode here next Monday. Thank you very much. And thank you,
Thank you.
All right.
Amanda, and all the staff at OLLI at University of Arkansas. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye, John.